Shalom Aleichem, this is Rabbi Kovacs, and we are learning our Mishnah Yomi on Yud Daled Nisan, the famous Erev Pesach, which was the subject of quite a bit of the first few chapters of Pesachim. And now we are starting this sixth chapter, Mishnah Aleph. Elu Dvarim BePesach Dochin et Shabbat. These are the things about the ritual of the Korban Pesach that override Shabbat. Now we know that we do at least slaughter the Korban Pesach on Shabbat because it says B'mo'ado. In its time is the literal meaning, which it also says by the Korban Tamid, the daily offering, which is also brought on Shabbat. So at least the slaughter overrides Shabbat. And these are the other things that override Shabbat. Shechitato, as we mentioned, Zrikat Damo, throwing the blood, Mihui Kravav, cleaning out the kishkas, because if you don't, they're going to get rotten. Hekter Cholovav, and burning up the fats on the Mizbeach. Now, technically, they could wait, because we do burn leftover fats at night, but the mitzvah is really to do it during the day. Avot tzliato, but the roasting of it, the chadochat kravav, and rinsing off all the kishkas, einu dochen Shabbat. Those things can wait until after Shabbat. So if Yud Daled Nisan is on Shabbat, so it's b'moado, you have to bring the Korban Pesach then, but any of the roasting or the other cooking preparations, which are a malacha, which you don't do on Shabbat, those wait until after Shabbat. The Mishnah continues, harkavato, and schlepping it, carrying it on your shoulders to the temple, havato michutz tchum, or bringing it from outside the tchum to Yerushalayim to use, v'chatichat yabalto, or cutting off a wart, which is a temporary blemish, a temporary mum, which would invalidate the sacrifice, but if you can remove it, it would still be okay. Ein dochin et Shabbat. These do not override Shabbat. And with the second set, the chiddush is these are things that could be derabanan, because we learned in Masechet Shabbat, Chai nosei atzmo, living being helps you carry it. So carrying a living being is a derabanan prohibition, not biblical. Or bringing out of the tchum, we've learned in Erevin, tchumin are derabanan according to most opinions. And the yabalto, you could technically remove the wart without using a scalpel, and it would be derabanan. So even though they're derabanans, they do not override Shabbat. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Dochin. Rabbi Eliezer says they do override. Now, Rabbi Eliezer holds that anything involved in the Korban Pesach overrides Shabbat and is allowed because of B'moado, because that's the time for Korban Pesach. We learned a similar discussion in Shabbat by Perek Rabbi Eliezer de Mila, the chapter starting Rabbi Eliezer about Bris Mila, where famously Rabbi Eliezer held that any of the preparations and steps necessary for a bris would override Shabbos as well. Now, here in Mishnah Beis, Rabbi Eliezer continues to explain his opinion. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, halo dinhu, is it not logical? Ma im shchita shimishim malacha, the slaughter of the Korban Pesach, which is mamish, it's a malacha deraisa, it's a biblically forbidden activity on Shabbat, doche at Shabbat, but it overrides because of moado. Elu, these other items, mishum shvut, that are only rabbinically prohibited, the ones that the Mishnah listed just above, lo yidchol the Shabbat, certainly it's logical they should override Shabbat. Amar lo Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Yehoshua, his colleague, says back, Yom Tov yochiach. Yom Tov proves otherwise. Shehitiru mishum malacha, that there are certain malachot that are forbidden on Shabbat. They're allowed on Yom Tov, like cooking or even slaughtering an animal if you needed the fresh meat. Al servo mishum shvut. But other things that are not absolutely necessary are still forbidden rabbinically. So there's certain things on Yom Tov that they're biblical malachot, like slaughtering and cooking and baking and roasting, but they're allowed on Yom Tov, l'tzorech ochel nefesh, because you need what to eat on Yom Tov. You need fresh food on Yom Tov, but other things are still rabbinically prohibited. So it's not a challenge. So Rabbi Yehoshua is bringing proof against Rabbi Eliezer's challenge. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says back, Ma ze Yehoshua? What are you talking about, Yehoshua? You see, they were on a first name basis, very friendly. Ma raya reshut lemitzvah. How can you bring a proof of a reshut, something that is allowed but not required, such as eating fresh food on Yom Tov? Technically, you could have done all your cooking and baking erev Yom Tov and not need to cook anything on Yom Tov, technically. It's a special heter. If you want to have fresh food, you're allowed to cook. So you can't bring that allowance versus a mitzvah, a requirement of doing Korban Pesach b'moado. Heishiv Rabbi Akiva v'amar. Now, Rabbi Akiva replies, and he says, and he's not using first names here because both Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer were teachers of Rabbi Akiva. So he's speaking to his colleagues, but they're also his teachers, his rebbeim. And he brings a proof, hazah tochiach. Sprinkling should prove it. Now this hazah, the sprinkling, is from the famous para aduma water, the red heifer purification water. She mitzvah, it's a mitzvah for someone who was tameh, who is impure from a corpse to become purified using the paraduma water. V'hi mishum shvut. And it's forbidden on Shabbat as a shvut. It's rabbinically forbidden to do the biblical mitzvah of becoming tahor with the paraduma water on Shabbat. Ve'ena docheh Shabbat, so it does not override Shabbat. So Rabbi Akiva continues, Afa ta yutu al titmal elu. Don't be surprised about these things in the Mishnah. Shafal pisha hen mitzvah, even though it's a mitzvah of Karban Pesach, hen mishum shavut, and these are details of Karban Pesach that are rabbinically prohibited. Lo yidchot Shabbat. They don't override Shabbat. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer replies to Rabbi Akiva, I can have logic against you also. Ma im shchita. What about slaughtering the Pesach? Shemishim malocha. It's mamish a biblical activity. Docheh the Shabbat. It overrides Shabbat because of bimo ado, in its right time. Hazah, sprinkling the ashes of paraduma water. Shemishim shvut. That's rabbinically prohibited. Einu din shadachis Shabbat. It should also override Shabbat. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says back to Eliezer, O chilaf, but you could reverse it around. You could reverse the logical flow here. Ma'im hazah shu mishum shvat, just like sprinkling the paraduma water, it's only rabbinically prohibited on Shabbat. Einu docheh the Shabbat, it still does not override Shabbat. Shechita, slaughtering the Karban Pesach, shimishim malacha, that it's a mamish, it's a biblical malacha, that's even worse. Einu din shetitchet the Shabbat, that should not be allowed. And in Shalom to the Shabbat, it should not be allowed on Shabbat. So he's reversing the logical flow of Rabbi Eliezer to show him otherwise. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is back. Akiva, akarta mashakatu b'Torah. If you say that, you're uprooting what's written in the Torah. If you learn out from hazah, which is rabbinically prohibited, to shechita, which is biblically a malacha, but you say it's not allowed on Shabbat, that's against what's written in the Torah. It says ben arbayim b'moado, in the afternoon, in its time, bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat. Whether it's a weekday, whether it's a Shabbat, because the Torah says b'moado, bein arbayim, it's the afternoon of Yud Daled Nisan today, whether or not it's Shabbat or not. So Rabbi Akiva has actually accomplished his logical goal here. Amar lo, he says back to Rabbi Eliezer, Rebbe, my master, haveli moed le'elu. If you would show me a pasuk in the Torah for these details of Karban Pesach, Kimoed l'shchita, that is like the moed written by shchita, by the actual slaughter of the Karban Pesach. So what Rabbi Akiva here is saying is, if there was a pasuk that said that these specific details, the rinsing and the carrying and the schlepping out of the tchum and the rabbinical details of bringing a Pesach that aren't strictly necessary, because he could have schlepped the Karban Pesach into the tchum yesterday or carried it to the Har Bayis yesterday before Shabbos. So he says, if there was a pasuk that said you have to schlepp the Karban Pesach b'moado, I would agree to you, but only the offering, the shchita of the Karban Pesach must be b'moado, and that's why it overrides. But these other details, these shvutim, they don't override. Now Rabbi Akiva sums up his logic here. Klal Amar Rabbi Akiva, a general rule states Rabbi Akiva, Kol malacha she'efshar lasotam erev Shabbat. If it's something you could have done yesterday, you could have schlepped the animal to Har Bayis yesterday, you could have brought it into the Techum yesterday, you could have cut off the wart yesterday. Eino dochet Shabbat. You can't do it on Shabbat. If he's got a warty Karban Pesach, he's got to find a different group that has a good Karban Pesach. But shchita, the slaughtering, and so too the zrika, and the things that are absolutely necessary, Shabbat, you can't possibly do them Erev Shabbat. You can't do the shchita of Karban Pesach on Yud Gimel B'Nisan, Dochet Shabbat. Those override the Shabbat. This is similar to a rule that he says by Bris Milah. Rabbi Eliezer says by Bris Milah, when we learn Shabbat, that he's not as expansive as Rabbi Eliezer's opinion of allowing anything involved in the Milah, but only the things that can't be done Erev Shabbos, those would also override Shabbos by Pesach and by the Milah. So Baruch Hashem, we've been zocheh to learn about Erev Pesach and Yud Daled Nisan on Mamish Yud Daled Nisan, and God willing, B'ezrat Hashem, I will pre-record the Mishnayot for the next couple days, so we can learn them Erev Pesach when we're done eating bagels, and this afternoon when there's no more bagels, no more donuts to eat. So what we're going to do, you're going to learn Mishnah Yomi. That'll be good. Achakashav v'sameach, tizku l'mitzvot, everybody. Kol hakavod.